Hi there. Today I'm going to show you a technique, the technique of using cold wax resist on paper. Basically it's cold wax, meaning that it's not heated up like batik. It creates a certain texture. It's much more textured, and you can't be as specific as you can with a hot wax. When you're drawing, you can actually draw with hot wax, but this creates more of a texture and just not as specific lines, but it's a really nice effect. You can paint it on directly on the white paper. Sorry, you can put the wax directly on the white paper and use colors over it, or you can color it first and wax on top and then color again. A lot like batik in the process, but you're using a wax pencil. We can also use the wax to rub on a texture to get a pattern. I'll be showing you that as well. Fairly basic materials. You need a plain candle, just white, or you can also use the paraffin wax you get at the grocery store to do preserving. It usually comes in blocks. Just break a piece off so you can use it to draw. And then paper, as usual, my favorite paper that I use for most of my techniques is my favorite, a Strathmore Drawing 80 pounds. It's just a beautiful paper. It takes the dye really well, and it holds it. It still has nice body when you've already painted it. You can use any drawing paper or watercolor paper. Just don't just take the paper from your printer, because it won't work. It won't hold the wetness. You need something with a little more oomph than printer paper. And the last thing is, of course, the dyes or paints. You can use watercolor. If you have a lot of watercolor paints at home, then go ahead and use them. What I use is called silk paint. This one is called Liquid Colors. It's from G&S Dye in Toronto. And one of the basic positive things about this is that you get big amounts. You have a big quantity. If you're going to be painting big sheets of paper and, wanting this solid coverage to then wax over, this is very handy. It does work the best in my opinion, but go ahead and use watercolors if that's what you have on hand. You also use food color just to play with it. I'm sure food color would work if you're just wanting to play and see if it feels like something you want to do. So that covers the materials, hopefully. So let's start. Of course, the other thing I forgot to mention is that you need brushes. I'm using fairly large brushes so I can cover a large area quickly. This all depends on you too. You might be working in small, then you would only need, you could use watercolor and you could use small brushes. So the other thing I also do to cover the paper better is I add a little bit of water to the dyes. You don't have to. But I found that it's easier to spread. It spreads better without soaking in. If I don't add the water, the dye soaks in very quickly and it doesn't spread as much. That's what I find. But again, you may have a reason not to add water. You might want it to soak in. It might not be a problem. So the watchword here is play, experiment. So I'm going to draw with my wax, and I do want to press pretty hard just to make sure there's enough resist there. It's difficult when you're doing it on white because you can't really see. It's hard to see what you've just done. I'm just going to do a small area here. I'm pressing fairly hard. If it was a shape that I was just like a circle, I think I'd go over it a couple times to make sure there's enough wax. I can't see those wavy lines anymore, so I can't really go over them. Okay, so I'll just dip my brush in the red, which looks like it already was a bit watery, and the magic is that the wax resists so well. Isn't that fun? It's always, no matter how many times you do this, it's always fun to see the resist appear. So that's the basic thing of what you're doing. You can see how quickly that spread, and I I've been able to cover that whole area pretty quickly. Now I would let that dry. While we're doing that, I did have a thought of something you could do to make more of an image. I'm going to try to make something that looks a bit like grass. So you could, if you're making collage or doing, you could try to make some of your textures with this technique. Let's just take this other brush and try my green. As you're working with it, you'll come up with ideas of how you could use it. That's kind of a rough texture of grass. I guess you could work on how to make a bit more specific textures. Hot wax is better for that kind of more graphic and being able to do something a bit more specific, a bit more detailed. Let's do, if you might want a plaid. Do thick lines and thin lines. Or you might want just a pattern like polka dots. As I said, you can't, I will do another video on hot wax. You can be a lot more specific with hot wax. Put some of the green over the dots. And of course you could come up with all kinds of interesting ways to layer colors in wax. Depends what you're doing, how you would use this technique. But that's the simplicity of how it works. It's fairly simple. Now what I do, we'll let this dry and I'll show you how to finish it off, because sometimes you could leave the wax in paper, but sometimes, depending what you're using the paper for, you might want to take most of it out. I will show you how to do that at the end. So that's just the drawing on a white, using the wax on white paper and doing one color. I'm going to put this aside. And usually I just have some newsprint on the floor. This is not messy. See, the color hasn't gone through. So I could just lay this anywhere, really. I'm going to put it aside to dry. And I have some previous ones here that I've colored. So you can also start with a color. I'm going to draw with wax on this. I think I would like, I didn't do a grid on the other one. Okay, I'm going to do kind of a plaid on this one. And I suppose you could try to cut this wax down so it's, I always have dye and things in my fingernails, please forgive that. You could cut this down to being a skinnier piece of wax and try to do something a little more specific. And there we have our little coral grid. Isn't that cute? It's so quick. You can achieve quite cool results. And then, of course, I'm just thinking this, say this was supposed to be a plaid fabric or something in your collage. Once it's dry, you could also draw lines or add more wax lines just to make it more detailed. Usually, I could right now get a smaller brush, and before it's even dry, I could try adding a little more color, like every second. Usually I let it dry before I would add a second color, but you could play around like that to color in some of the squares. Okay, that's what an example of having the paper colored already, painted already, and then doing the wax and a second color. This paper was painted with my dyes. I have never tried to use previously colored paper. One of the things is it has to be a light color. If I got a rich blue or red colored paper and waxed over that, when I coat it with any of these colors, it's not going to, you will have a difference, but the final color, when you paint over with one of these dyes, that color will be pretty dark. because you're starting with quite an intense color. Usually I would start with this yellow, or I have this pale, this soft green, or a soft pink. I usually start with a soft color like that if I'm going to wax and paint over it. So that's those two. And the next thing we're going to do is the rubbing, wax rubbing. Okay, we're going to do wax rubbing. I happen to have these old Tibetan carved printing blocks. They were made for fabric. Anything you can find, if you happen to have something, you can rub the texture off a found object. It's just to show you, hopefully you have something you can rub, but it's just kind of interesting to see that you can do this. It's the same process as in England. They do wax rubbings of gravestones and things like that. They use a gold wax crayon instead of just plain wax. So here we go. We have to hold that down. Now, really, I should tape the edges to make sure it doesn't move and everything if I want a perfect rubbing, but right now I'm just going to go for it. So I'm using the side of the wax. I think my candle has a little bit of color on it. I'm rubbing quite hard, and again, because the wax is clear, you can't really see where you're drawing too well. I think I'd like this to be kind of a natural edge, not the square edge. So it looks like a fragment of something. So I'm just going to rub that far. There. You don't have to wait for the wax to dry or harden or anything. You can just go right ahead and paint. Okay, which color? I think I'll use this coral color again. With this, sometimes I like to do it a little quickly and not let too much dye get on there, because sometimes it's not like when you use batik with hot wax, you have to make the wax goes right through to the other side. This is kind of sitting on top, so I don't want to take a lot of time letting a lot of wet dye sitting there, because it might go underneath the wax and not resist. So I'm spreading it over pretty quickly. So there you have this pattern. And I could let that dry. If I wanted a darker color, I'm thinking I would like that to be darker, really. I could let it dry and do another set, but eventually the more wetness you put on this, the more likely it is to go under the wax. So that's the wax rubbing technique. So again, to go back to some of these samples, just to show you what you can do. This one was white wax, but then painting stripes the other way, so it's very colorful. This one also had stripes, but I had the stripes first, and then I did the wax over top of some of the stripes, and then painted over again. As you can see, it gets a little duller and darker the more color you have in there, because the colors start blending. This one was a little different. I just did it on white paper with the spirals, painted it that light green, and then I let it dry, and then did these leaves with the wax on the light green, and then painted it over with the darker green. So I get two colors in the wax drawing. This one was stripes underneath. It was yellow and bluey green stripes, it looks like. And then I did the wax and then painted in this brown color over the whole thing. So the blue and green become this darker brown, and the yellow becomes this caramel. It's like batik. It's kind of, because if you start layering colors, you might get some surprises, because you've forgotten if you've got more than one color underneath, you might not be thinking about what the top color is going to do with all of those colors, but it's fun. It's fun to play. And this one was on white paper again, but then I painted actually wavy stripes on top of that instead of just painting a solid color. In fact, I think what I did here is I painted blue, and then afterwards I came along and purposely painted the purple around the white stripes. So have fun with that, and in a minute I will show you how to remove the wax if you so desire. Okay, my paper's dry now. We've gone through all the basics of how to put the wax on. And the dye, at this point, the wax, I haven't done anything with the wax. This wax doesn't feel that thick, to be honest. But sometimes it is quite thick. If you want to remove some, either the eventual thing, I will iron this. You don't have to iron it, but as you can see, the paper curls a bit. If I iron it like this, there'll be a bit of a halo, a dark halo around the wax because of the excess wax on the top. And it may happen more or less, but I don't like that. So what I'm going to do is scrape the wax off. Obviously it won't all come off, but the top part, the excess will. I'm using a butter knife. Make sure it's not too serrated because that will start ripping your paper. And then I'm just holding it on a very low angle, and I'm just going to scrape along the line. And really, for some reason, there isn't a lot of excess wax on this. I don't really see any coming off, but often, sometimes if I've done if I've gone over the same line twice, there'll be extra wax. You can see some of it coming off. At least, you can see little bits of it on the knife. Sorry, this is shaking my camera a little bit. Try to go more smoothly. So you would do that down every wax line. Yeah, there really isn't a lot on this, so. And here's the other one. This was the one where there's way more on this. I can feel it. This was the rubbing. I usually do this away towards the edge of the paper because you don't want the wax that you lift up and go in one direction. You don't want the wax that you lift up to stick to the rest of the paper. You want it to come right off. Wax is very sticky and messy, so, and you want it to put it like over to the side so it's not getting on the bottom of the paper at some point. Sometimes when you do this, if there's a lot of wax on there, your pattern will all of a sudden become much clearer, but there isn't a ton of wax on here. See, there's just a bit. I'll just leave that on the newsprint. Okay, now it's ready to iron. And I think what I'll do is just, you don't really need an extra piece of paper on that. I just use an iron, just heat it up to, you don't need steam. See the wax? It's now, I'll iron this grid to see if any of it comes through. I didn't scrape. You can see some of the wax has made the yellow lines darker. That's where there was more wax and it went right through the paper. So I guess I could have scraped a little bit more off. It may just be this paper as well. So now the wax is set in there, and that's your paper. It gives the paper, it can, depending on the type of paper, it could give the paper a nice extra texture. This paper was quite firm and quite a good weight. It's 80 pounds, so it doesn't change it that much. And here's our other one. These little spots on the wax of dye, if you don't like that, what I would have done was taken a paper towel, not when it's soaking wet, but just a minute or so after when you've allowed the paint to soak into the paper, but there's still spots there, and just dab those spots off with a piece of paper towel if you don't like that effect. More than that. Right, I didn't scrape it. And it's not creating a halo, so you'll find I will do a hot wax batik tutorial, and you will see that that does create a halo. So there, this paper's all ready to use, unless now at this point, if I wanted to paint over that again, the wax would not resist as well, because I've ironed it into the paper, and I've taken some off. So you wouldn't do the ironing or the scraping until you're totally finished. And that is cold wax on paper. Have fun with it.